Con. Chauvinism. The French have an international reputation for being unjustifiably arrogant. I remember during my first touristing there, taking a train to the centre of the country, being treated like a peasant. I suppose at the time I was, being only 6 months away from Australia. It was not pleasant. The Americans despise the arrogance of the French. The French see the Americans as a culture too unsophisticated to be worthy of being the new number one. American movies, America's main cultural export, are aimed at a middle-browed audience to maximize profits, which expresses clearly America's strong commercialist middle-browed values. Where the Americans value quantity and profits, the French, with their stronger elitist traditions, value quality. So the American movies coming out of Hollywood are dismissed as commercial by the French, with connotations of being vulgar, lower class, infantile, and unworthy of a French intellectual's attention. I dare say a lot of American intellectuals are of the same opinion. When one strolls through the opulence of Louis XIV's Versailles, near Paris, and reflects on the fact that the other monarchs of Europe tried to copy him, one realizes where French arrogance came from. It was justified. It's easy to be arrogant when one feels superior. My children complain at the arrogance of Americans visiting Australia, but having lived in both Australia and the US, I can readily understand why the Americans would sneer at Australia's small-minded mentality. France was the dominant culture in Europe for many centuries. Its high-class culture was the model for other upper classes in other countries, for example Russia, the German princedoms, etc. It was chic to sprinkle French terms into one's speech, the way young people today do with American terms, to show off how hip, that is how modern they are. After 500 years of this cultural dominance, it's not surprising that the idea of French superiority went to French heads. It wasn't until the 1990s that the French finally woke up to the reality that France was no longer the centre of the world. They discovered that their institutions and standards over the decades had become rather mediocre and not so spécial. I'm told, although I did not see it due to the fact that I was living in Japan during the 1990s, that it was international cable television, Brussels style, although the Belgians were a decade or two ahead of the French that way, that finally taught millions of French citizens that they were not at the forefront of world achievement. For example, their economic growth was mediocre compared to other world-class cultures. The Brits had won several times as many Nobel Prizes as the French. French social legislation and customs were several decades behind the Scandinavians, etc. In short, France was and also ran like a racehorse in a race that did not win. French intellectuals started bemoaning their inferior status and longed for the grand old days when French culture was unquestionably dominant. The French finally learned to lose their arrogance. Hygiene. One aspect of the French that I found particularly offensive was their lack of personal hygiene. It struck me as paradoxical that French men could preen themselves in front of a mirror for a quarter of an hour, yet not flush their toilets. I remember being with my first wife on a vacation at a nudist colony on the south coast of France, called Cap d'Agde, coast of France, during a hot summer just before our first son was conceived, talking to other nationals from Germany, Holland, etc., whose languages I could speak by then. They were complaining how much the public toilets stank due to the fact that the French didn't flush. One Dutchman who had been to the site the previous year remarked, "Don't worry, August is almost over. The French will leave and the smell will go away." That is precisely what happened. The Germanic peoples remaining in the camp, that is the British, the Dutch, the Germans, the Danes, etc., felt a collective disgust for the lack of French hygiene. I hope the French have improved a bit since then. La surface, the surface. The French give much greater importance to the way things look, that is, the appearance of things, than do the Anglo-Saxons, who worry more about how well things work. This translates into beautiful architecture and a Paris that is beautiful to look at. Even Paris's modern buildings are imposing and aesthetically beautiful. For example, the relatively new La Défense, which is France's defense building, equivalent to Washington's Pentagon, for example. That is the administrative center of the Department of Defense for France. Yet When less importance is given to functionality, people can suffer. I remember in the 1970s buying a French plastic hair shampoo bottle. It looked great, really stylish, but when the time came to use it and get the liquid out of the bottle, it didn't flow, despite heavy whacking at the bottom of the bottle. Bah! Frogs! In brackets. A frog is a pejorative term used by the English to refer to a Frenchman, because the French eat frogs' legs, a custom considered bizarre to the insular-minded English. In my view, things need to be both good-looking and functional. I think the French could learn something from the Scandinavians on that score. E. Germany. Pro. Respect. If someone were to ask me which culture, up to pre-World War II, would I have respected the most, I would have answered Germany. Just think of what Germany has given to world culture, and compare that list with other countries. Think of German classical music, German philosophy, German literature, German quality engineering, and especially German science. A few months before migrating to China, my seventh country, I took myself off on an intellectual pilgrimage to Göttingen, the world-famous German university, equivalent to England's Cambridge or Oxford. I walked around the town, filled with old houses with plaques on their walls saying, "Famous person X lived here from 1 AAA to 1 BBB." There were so many famous names whom I'd known of most of my adult life that I was humbled. My God, I thought, what an enormous contribution to world culture Germany has made. Germany is the most populous country in Europe, with about 80 million people. It was big enough and powerful enough to be deluded enough to think it could defeat the world. Fortunately, Germany's years of political delusion and horror only lasted for a decade. Throughout most of its history, it has remained one of the planet's leading cultures, a position it maintains today. Discipline in English. Germany functions well. It is well organized, and Germans get impatient when things don't run smoothly due to lack of organization or mental laziness. Germans pay attention to detail and are capable of superb quality engineering. They are world famous for that. All this I admire. I suspect that the Americans inherited a lot of that mentality due to the very large numbers of Germans who migrated to the US. As a result, both cultures function well, which is so unlike the culture I'm currently living in, that is China, where the lack of efficiency and the high degree of mental laziness is maddening. Con. Most hated. Not too many decades ago, the Germans were the world's most hated people. They caused more human misery on such a mass scale that they deserved the hatred of the world. They became a formidable enemy when their history led them to use all their discipline, their organization, and industrial might towards killing people at the hands of a fanatical, deranged leader. A recent Chancellor of Germany remarked that he thought that there was something crazy about German culture, that periodically in its long history it had gone off the rails. Ad-libbing now. I've changed my tune on that. I'm now, thanks to the internet, I've become conscious of the monopoly control of the Jewish media. And I learned, thanks to the internet, that Hitler, in fact, was the savior of Western Europe. Because in 1941, Stalin had amassed an invasion army of about 6 million Russian soldiers to conquer Europe. So West Europeans can thank the fact to Hitler that West Europeans did not become part of the Soviet Union. And then they would have been holocausted the way the Jewish communist, and Stalin was Jewish, Trotsky was Jewish, Lenin was a quarter or a half Jewish, Roosevelt was Jewish, Churchill was Jewish. So Stalin killed off about 66 million white Christian Russians in his purges and the Civil War and so forth. According to the highly respected Solzhenitsyn, the Russian author, Nobel Prize winner in literature. So, if you're logical, the West Europeans should put Hitler's face on the euro, they should erect statues to him, because he saved them from the purges of Stalin and the Jewish communists. Back to the book. In the 30 Years' War that followed Luther's protest against the corruptions of the Catholic Church, particularly the custom of buying indulgences, whereby Catholics could give money to the Church to obtain forgiveness, thus profiting the Church mightily, about a third of the German population was killed off in an orgy of fanatical bloodletting between Catholics and Protestants. One of the main motives behind the creation of the European Union was to so integrate the economies of France and Germany that no fourth major war between the two of them could be possible. That goal now seems to have been achieved. The EU is now the largest trading bloc in the world and may even become the stepping stone towards the creation of a global state. More on this idea later in this book. The Germans may have killed some 50 million people in World War II, which must make it one of the greatest crimes in all of human history. But at least they have educated themselves about their massive crimes and feel genuine shame for what they have done. Ad-libbing again. As I understand it, some 50-odd thousand Germans were massacred in Western Poland, largely by the Jewish communists sending in saboteurs and so forth into Poland, trying to promote a war between Poland and Germany, which eventually worked. So Hitler just lost patience with Poland and trying to save more massacres of Germans in Poland. I could go on and on. Back to the book. It's not easy being a German tourist outside Germany. So you can see how, ad-libbing again now, you can see how much I've changed my tune thanks to the internet, being educated. When I wrote this, I was brainwashed. Other Europeans had been too well educated about Germany's war crimes to be easily forgiving. I wish I could say the same thing about the Japanese, or the Japs, as I say, when I'm in an angry mood. I will say more about the unrepentance of the Japanese and their massive war crimes against the Chinese later in this chapter. F. Japan. Before launching into the pros and cons of Japan, I need to give a bit of introduction to this section, because it differs from the others in that nearly all of it was written in 1997, when I was still living in Japan. I have chosen to change it very little, for several reasons, since it's been 7 years at the time of writing. Okay, so 2004. Since I've lived in Japan, the original text is fresher and more immediate than anything I could write now about Japan that would have to be based on 7-year-old memories. Also, it may be interesting for readers to see what I was thinking about 10 years ago. In a sense, the original text on which this section is based is the harbinger of this book, although in those days I was not a globist, but was a multi, as the text below shows. This section on Japan is a lot longer than the sections on the other 7 countries. One of the reasons for this is I feel the Japanese are the most mono of the 8 and hence suffer the most because of that. So I use Japan as a paradigm case of how monos suffer, and therefore discuss their situation at greater length than the others. I think the case of Japan is most instructive to other countries because the plight of the Japanese seems to confirm my claim that the more mono you are, the more you will suffer. There are other reasons for its length, as will be explained shortly. This section is also formatted slightly differently from the other countries' sections. It begins with a request made in 1997 for Japanese translators to translate the original text into Japanese. This request was a part of my original text. I choose to include it here because I want to keep the whole document pretty much intact, so as to convey more accurately how I was thinking and feeling at the time, that is, in 1997. Ad-libbing now, that was 20 years ago. Having already lived 5+ years in the country, I also hope that the quality of my writing has improved a bit over the 10-year period. The original text appeared in a short and a long version, which are both included here. It keeps the same pro-con format and is as hard-hitting as the other sections in this chapter. It is dated a bit, but the basic praises and criticisms haven't changed much, unfortunately. Maybe cultures change more slowly than I'm hoping for. The original title of this essay was Living in Japan as a Western Researcher, Pros and Cons. Request to Japanese translators. If you are Japanese and are a highly competent English to Japanese translator, I would like to translate this essay into Japanese. I would be most grateful to receive it from you, preferably in electronic form. Your name would be publicly attached to the translation on this website if you so wish. Your translation could then be used to spread this essay throughout Japan, and particularly to the Japanese media, ministries and political parties. Note to Japanese readers. Quite a few Japanese readers have emailed me asking me what my real motivation is for writing this essay, especially since it is so critical of Japan in certain respects. Here is my motive. I've lived in Japan now for over 5 years, mainly because I believe that Japan will give me the best long-term, 20-year, economic deal to build my very expensive artificial brains. But the social critic in me is unhappy with Japan. I see Japan as socially backward, third world. I would like to be proud of the country that I will spend the next 20 years living in. One of Japan's fairly recent prime ministers said that he would like to see Japan become a social superpower. I too would like to see that, but for that to happen, Japan's cultural norms will need to undergo considerable reforms. In order to know what is wrong with Japan, Japan will need social critics to focus attention upon its weaknesses. I believe that this job is better done by multicultured foreigners who live in Japan than monocultured Japanese, for the simple reason that the foreigners, that is Westerners, can see more clearly where Japan is behind, because the Westerners are at least several decades ahead of Japan in the general social modernization process that most industrialized countries in the world, including Japan, are going through. I am critical of Japan socially, but I'm trying to be constructively critical so that my criticisms can be used as intellectual fuel by Japanese social reformers to help modernize Japan. I'm not just a simple Japan basher. I live here by choice, remember. I hope most of my Japanese readers understand that I'm trying to perform a useful function in helping to make Japanese readers more conscious of the country's social inadequacy. It's one of my life goals. If Japan wants to be respected socially by the West, then Japan needs to know what the West thinks of Japan and what Western social standards are that the West uses to judge Japan. Hopefully, this essay contributes to such knowledge. Japanese readers are requested to look upon this essay as an educational tool for social reform in Japan. That it is constructively critical rather than destructively critical. Introduction. This long essay is aimed mainly at Western researchers who are considering the possibility of living and researching long-term in Japan, but it is hoped that general readers interested in Japan may also find it informative. I've tried to be fair to Japan, but I also don't pull any punches. I hope you enjoy it, although I doubt the Japanese will like those parts where I am critical of Japan, sometimes harshly. I've lived in Japan's science cities, Tsukuba and Kansai, for 5 years now, and have some idea of what the country is like, although not as deep a knowledge as someone who has made the gargantuan effort to learn Japan's extraordinarily clumsy writing system, which excludes me from participating in Japan's intellectual life, a major handicap. So if you are a Japanese reader and you don't agree with some of my opinions due to my ignorance of Japanese ideas expressed in the Japanese media, then you're probably right. Please make the appropriate allowances. It takes Japanese students 9 years to learn the Chinese characters, kanji, and I haven't bothered yet, ? This essay has been written incrementally as I thought of a point worth writing about and over time. It is constructed as follows. At first, I give a brief overview of what I think of Japan, so readers can get a taste of the details to follow. What follows is a list of points divided into 2 groups, that is, the advantages and disadvantages, from my point of view as a socially and politically conscious Western observer of a Western researcher's life in Japan. The style will be intellectually honest, that is, sometimes blunt and not particularly diplomatic. My personality type makes me prefer intellectual honesty to diplomacy, when the two clash. In the long term, I believe that people who are known to be intellectually honest are usually more respected and read than diplomatic white liars. There are major cultural differences on this point. Westerners tend to prefer intellectual honesty and straight talking, whereas the Japanese prefer not to offend anyone, to the point that there's very little criticism in Japan, with all the consequences for Japanese science, creativity and intellectual life that preference creates. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The very brief essay. If you want my opinion about Japan in a nutshell, based on 5 years of living here and reading books and lots of books about Japan, culture, history, pro and con, etc., then I can express it as follows. Japan, economic giant, social pygmy. The brief essay. In other words, I am basically in Japan for financial reasons. I respect Japan's economic prowess and believe it has a better economic and hence scientific future than America, given that money buys brains. However, since the economic performance of Japan over the past few years has been rather poor compared to the 1980s, I'm starting to have a few doubts, but not strong ones. I argue that Japan has significantly higher savings and investment rates than America, so Japan will win. Japan's savings rate is about 15%, whereas America's is less than 5%. If a country doesn't save, it can't invest. A country which doesn't invest in its future won't have one. I foresee a growing economic and political decline in the US, comparable with what happened to the UK. My highest priority in life is to build artificial brains, an activity which will be increasingly expensive. Hence I need to live in a country which is rich enough and willing enough to spend the money to research and develop such expensive monsters. For this reason I choose to live in Japan. So far I have not regretted this decision, and I am someone who has lived in 6 countries, Australia, England, Holland, Belgium, America and Japan, and speak 4+ languages. I am very cynical of national prejudices and pretensions, having seen too many gods and conflicting customs. I have a very cold eye and make international comparisons easily, given my life history. Unfortunately for me, I am a social critic. I have 2 major components to my intellectual interests, namely brain building, with a broad passionate interest in most of the hard sciences, having over 4,000 books in my private library then. It eventually rose to about 12,500 paper books. Then I got rid of them, and still getting rid of them, converting them into electronic form. And I have about 50,000 papers and books in electronic form. And social criticism. Sometimes I wish I were a narrow-minded engineer who cares nothing about the politics or sociology of the world outside the lab. If I were like that, then Japan's social backwardness, from my Western point of view, and moral failures would not get on my nerves so much. There are aspects of the Japanese that I like, even love, and admire very much, but there are other aspects which I frankly despise. I said I would be blunt sometimes. So I have to live with a strongly ambivalent attitude to my chosen country, the country I will probably die in if my friendships with Japanese continue to deepen. Well, that didn't happen. Ad-libbing. I eventually got fed up and left. So, the rest of the bulk of this essay will consist of point-by-point descriptions of what I see as the advantages and disadvantages of living in Japan as a Western researcher. Having read these points, the Western reader ignorant of Japan should be in a better position to judge whether he/she could live in Japan long-term. It's the long-term aspect that is the issue. Most Westerns in Japan stay a maximum of 3 years, then leave feeling alienated. Very few stay longer. I can certainly recommend a short-term stay, say a postdoc for a year or 2, to get a taste of an exotic culture from a Western point of view. From my own point of view, the economic benefits of Japan have to outweigh the social disadvantages for me to want to stay. If America's economic future of the next 20 years before I retire is actually as good as Japan's, then my decision to live in Japan will have been a mistake, because I feel I'm paying a high social cost living as a social critic in a country which is so backwards socially by Western standards in many respects. I want to be proud of my chosen country, not only of its economic successes, but of its social institutions as well. So far, I simply put up with the frustrations resulting from a lack of pride in Japan's level of social development due to my belief that Japan will give me a better deal to build my precious artificial brains, my top priority. However, Japan is changing, so there is hope that it might put as much energy into its social improvement in the future as it has put into its economic improvement in the past. I even hope to help this process along. For example, this essay, by getting fluent in spoken Japanese and getting on Japanese TV as a social critic. I was on the media 150 times in Europe in the early 1980s when I was pushing masculism, that's men's lib, so I have a lot of media experience. I believe Japan desperately needs social reform, so I want to help out. Like I say, I want to be proud of my adopted country. I am not a passive person. If I feel Japan is socially backward, I'm not happy to sit back and complain. I want to get out there and preach. This essay is a kind of sermon dedicated to the cosmopolitan god of social sophistication. Of course, if I want it to influence the Japanese, I'll have to get it translated. Many Japanese are hitting my website. To try to show that I am being fair to Japan, I will give my positive and negative impressions of life here, beginning with the positive impressions, and I will try to be objective. If Japanese readers feel I am just plain wrong on some points, then please email me at email profhugo.garis@yahoo.com. That email is still valid, by the way, pointing out the errors so that I can modify the essay. But remember that I can't read kanji, so you should expect a rather limited viewpoint compared to a native Japanese who has had a lifetime's exposure to Japanese opinions and lifestyles. I write from the outside, which makes me both more and less objective. More in the sense that I can see the Japanese from the viewpoint of the foreigner with my cosmopolitan mind, and less in the sense that I'm ignorant of the details of Japanese life because I don't really participate in it. The long essay. Pro. Number 1. I'm someone who has lived in 6 countries, then, now 7, because I'm ad-libbing now. I've lived 11 years so far in China, and I will leave in a year or so. Again, filler. So it is easy for me to make international comparisons. I do it all the time. I can see through local, that is national, pretensions and am sceptical of unjustifiable national claims. I've lived in big and little countries, in superior and inferior countries, according to my criteria. It is important for me to live in a country that I have a real pride in. I remember watching Neil Armstrong, the US astronaut, walk on the moon in 1969. That moment, I believe, was America's finest. And I felt enormous pride in the country, even though I'm not an American. It was an incredible achievement. It's nice having the feeling that one belongs to the world's top country. I've lived in the US long enough to know what that feeling is like, and if Americans could offer me a better research deal, I would prefer to live in the US rather than Japan, because I could then save myself the effort of having to put up with the many social disadvantages of Japan and not have to bother learning yet another language, and especially the kanji, the Chinese characters. But despite the social cost of being in Japan, I prefer to be here because I'm convinced that Japan is going to beat America, and within about 5 years, provided that Japan's politicians, bureaucrats, businessmen and voters can get their act together. The past few years have seen Japan really make a mess of its economy, running up a national debt almost equivalent to a year's GNP, with near zero growth rates, impotent political parties, corrupt bureaucrats, etc. However, history shows that the Japanese are an incredibly resourceful people. They went through a similar period after American gunboats opened up the country in the 1850s. After a few years of confusion figuring out what to do, they went on to become an industrial world power and even defeated Russia in the war of 1904-05. They recovered again after the Second World War and a third time after the oil shocks of the 1970s. They now have the world's highest GNP per capita, although in purchasing power term, that's PPP, purchasing power parity terms, they still lag America by about 10 to 20%. That's then. With American productivity being about 30% higher. But the gap is closing because the Japanese save and invest more. If the Japanese economy can get back on track, as it seems to be doing, for example, in 1966, Japan's growth rate was a respectable 3.6% in real terms, the best of the G7 countries, according to Japan's EPA, Economic Planning Agency. And during the first quarter of 1997, Japan had a very healthy 5% annualized growth rate. It will only be a few more years before Japan's real standard of living surpasses America's, and, very important to me, Japan will be able to routinely pay the world's best salaries to its researchers. That is, outclassing America's. The Japanese have a sense of mission and have had it since their defeat in World War II. They want to defeat America, not militarily of course, but economically. It's a question of national pride. To the Japanese, America is the country to beat. In fact, half jokingly, one gets the impression that in the Japanese mind there are 3 main countries in the world: Japan, America, other. The Japanese are an incredibly proud people, which for me is a two-edged sword. See the section below on Japan's superiority myth. They have a sense of superiority which drives them along. It took me 5 years before I knew a few Japanese well enough for them to truly open their hearts to divulge their deepest nationalist feelings, opinions that normally they would never convey to foreigners. In a sense, I share this feeling, and for the same reasons as the Japanese, I too can extrapolate economic trends. In fact, recently I was rereading Herman Kahn, K-A-H-N, who's obese futurist, American, old book written in the late 1960s, in which he predicted that Japan would become an economic superpower by right about now. In the 1960s, his ideas seemed fanciful, but he was right, as time has shown. I still have about 20 more working years before I choose to retire, and I expect in that time to see Japan become number one economically, with a superior GNP in absolute magnitude compared to the US. I also expect Japan will become number one scientifically by buying up most of the world's best scientific brains and bringing them to Japan. I'd like to see Japan become